Okay, good morning to everybody. We're going to get started, and I passed, for those of you here, I passed around the sign-in sheet. And one thing, if you weren't here on Thursday, and I had a seating chart. Did everybody here sign the seating chart? Okay, so I mean there aren't many here, so anyway, there's a seating chart required to have that for COVID purposes, for contact tracing purposes and whatnot. So I just want to make sure everyone had that. So, and this is the attendance sheet for today, in case anybody new shows up. So we're going to get started. This is week 2 of macro. So what we're going to do is, and first thing I want to do is I want to sort of direct everyone's attention to the screen here so that we can see in the Brightspace system what we're doing. This course is it's sort of hybrid in the sense that there's an element where some of the materials found in Brightspace, but for the most part, it's not really that hybrid of a course because it's really more of a. Is that too dark? Is that too bad? Okay, so hopefully that's okay for those watching on the screen, because it's really more of an activity where we take exams in Brightspace and that's about it. But I want to make sure everybody found out how to get to the recorded classes. What I'll do is sometime after the class ends, I'll go ahead and post the link to the class. So I just simply upload it to YouTube, so it's fairly easy to see. And I haven't actually loaded this week's yet, but there's not much. I'll get to that here after class. I'll load that information. But for the most part, we're pretty much on track with the syllabus. And we're gonna, and as I mentioned last week, we're gonna be sort of weaving in and out of the first 2 chapters, chapters 1 and 2, which are sort of introductory bits of material. And I think probably by, well, I don't know if Thursday we'll get to it, but we'll start to get into demand and supply, which is probably going to take us, well, certainly it's going to take us to the next week, and that was sort of planned. But and the PowerPoint presentation here, which I've sort of been going through, is also posted, and I'll post that for this week as well. So anyway, I just want to make sure everyone knew how to get to to those, and I think by now we have everybody who has wanted to, actually, I'm going to go ahead and download this. Everybody who's wanted to sign up for the class has done so. I think that I got a report over the weekend that some people have, we did late approvals for that did not end up signing up. And so if you're somehow on this, watching this video and have not signed up for the class, you need to get on that very quickly because you're going to run out of time. And I don't know how you can do that if you weren't enrolled, but I suppose you can get the link somehow. So anyway, so that's a little bit of housekeeping as far as that goes. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a bit about this and pick up from where we left off last time. I think this is about where we ended on Thursday of last week. We were talking about economic actors, and I think the very last bit was this idea of sectors of the economy. But I want to pick up on this idea of economic actors and talk about who they are, who's who, and who's what. And that is the idea that we've got really 3 main actor groups in the economy. So to sort of begin and continue this discussion, the who, what, when, where, why of economics, we're talking about the who's, we're talking about households, firms, and governments. And so the discussion from here is going to allow us really to build the first model that we're going to be building in this class, and that is of something called the circular flow model. I think I'm going to put it over. Kind of bear with me a minute here. Everything's kind of backwards in this room here, so there we go. So I don't know if you can, oh man, the camera angle is not great, is it? And I can't really turn this off because I lose the transmission. Let me put it over here maybe, because I'm just looking at the screen here. I'm thinking the angle's not particularly good. So I'm going to put my circular flow model over here. And there, if you've been reading the book, you will have already come across this idea of the circular flow model. And this is not a particularly good angle either, but I guess it's about as good as we're going to get. When we talk about models, what are we talking about here? We talk about models, and we use them a lot in economics. They are representations, they're illustrations, they're sometimes simulations. A lot of times we use modeling to determine what we think is going to happen, particularly when we try to implement a policy, say a tax cut. What's that going to do? What are the effects going to be? And that's not what we're going to model here. But we use a lot of modeling in the sense of trying to illustrate and try to find out what if. I mean, first of all, what is the purpose of studying macro in the first place if we can't solve economic problems? There's no point in solving econ anyway. So we have to build these sorts of models. And so the first we're going to build is something called the circular flow model. And I know we didn't do this last time, did we? I don't think we went over it now. Okay, so we're going to build a circular flow model. This is going to be really the first model that we're going to be building in a class. And so we're going to take these three actor groups, and they're going to be households. And there is no particular order as to where we put these. And I think I mentioned, if I didn't mention, then if you were to Google the term circular flow model, you would literally find millions of it from places like, well, course notes from places, syllabi, textbooks, online resources, all kinds of things. And there are all kinds of different orders. Some of them get more complex, and they've got all kinds of different flows. I mean, we'll have things like trade credits between countries. We're going to be making this very basic to start out with, and then we're going to make it a little bit more complex as we get through the class, because we're going to add the financial sector, we're going to add the rest of the world into it. But for right now, we're just going to start very basically with these three actor groups: households, governments, and firms. Okay, and so when we talk about economic events, what is probably one of the most basic events is this: the transfer from from firms to households of goods. That's pretty basic, isn't it? And we know that therefore households transfer their labor to firms. And essentially, that's really the foundation of what industrialization is about. And I bring up the term industrialization as sort of event, really. That is the idea that the Industrial Revolution began sometime, sort of indefinitely, but sometime in the 18th century, people began to leave home to go to work to provide their labor to firms. And so as a result, we're no longer providing for themselves for the most part, but we're exchanging labor as a commodity. And so labor has actually got its own market. And for those of you who study micro, you'll probably get into this idea of the economics of labor markets a bit more concretely. We're certainly going to talk about labor in this course, particularly from the standpoint of employment and unemployment. And we're going to get to that in a few weeks. We'll talk about it. And by the way, in terms of talking about this sort of complexity and sort of variety of different circular flow models, I can't recall if your text probably does, but it has something called a resource market, which is sort of an intermediate exchange. That is, people provide their labor in a competitive market against others. Right now, it doesn't seem like the labor market is particularly competitive, since jobs are relatively easy to get, but it is a competitive market. And also firms provide their goods through goods markets. That is, there's a competitive environment. And so I sort of cut that out here in order to sort of make this a bit easier to see, okay? Well, we know that these goods are not transferred for free. There's going to be flow in the other direction. That is, workers don't provide their labor for free. They provide it for wages. As a dollar figure, I think is about gone, isn't it? So wages are a dollar flow. And so it's compensating in the other direction, obviously. That's what the compensation is about. And then we know that goods aren't provided for free. There's got to be spending in the other direction. And you can see this on the video is clearly these markers are kind of, I think they lost some of their charge over the holiday there. So wages and spending. And when we talk about spending by households, we're going to sort of make this a little bit more concrete, talk about what we call consumption spending. But for right now, let's just refer to it as spending, okay? So I've got these two different wheels going around here. And it makes no difference whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise, goods and labor or whatever, and the same goes with the money flow. But we should talk about what we're getting at here. We talk about these red arrows here. What we're talking about here is a term that may be a little bit outdated, but it's still used, called the physical flow. The physical flow. And why that's a little bit maybe outdated is because a lot of the goods that we buy are not particularly physical. Medical services have sometimes not a very physical element to them, and that's a big part of our economy, about 1/6 of total spending. Streaming services, there's nothing really physical about it. Software, nothing physical. Almost all the services that are provided. And by the way, when we talk about goods and services, which we will in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about this distinction, this difference between what's a good as a physical good, and what's a service. And the area that's growing the fastest are services and not physical goods themselves. And services are characterized by not having a particularly physical nature. And labor, likewise, is not particularly physical in many ways as well. Certainly, if you take a look at what I do for a living, this is not particularly physical. You don't see me really exerting myself and risking life or limb. So the term's a little bit outdated. And so one of the terms which sort of emerged, well, it sort of emerged sometime during the financial crisis about 12 years ago, was this idea of the so-called real economy. I sort of put that in quotes because it's sort of an internal, informal term, the real economy. It's probably not a textbook kind of term, but and why does the term even come up in the first place, the term real economy? I mean, is there an unreal economy? And I guess the answer is, yeah, there sort of is. And it's this opposite flow here, these green arrows that we simply refer to as the financial flow, which is not unreal, but it's a little bit more difficult to pin down because of the fact that a lot of these transactions, these financial transactions, tend to be confidential. And we tend not to disclose some of these. And I know that, you know, public corporations, obviously, that whose stock and bonds trade on public exchanges, they do report their financial information. But even there, they try to conceal as much as possible by sort of jumbling it all together with subsidiaries and whatnot. But we really sort of keep this under wraps. In fact, what's one of the rudest things you can ask somebody if you just meet them would be what? A very rude question. Yeah.
Their salary?
Yeah, their salary. It's a pretty rude question, isn't it? Everybody wants you to know that they've got a very nice car out there in their driveway. So they want this element of the showiness of the goods, but they don't really want you to know anything about the dollar figure behind it. So it's kind of bizarre the way we have this, the way we are. We kind of want this to be a little bit undercover. And so as a result, it's a little bit less clear. And by the way, the financial crisis that began in 2008, really, you could argue began as early as 2005, was really an idea that the financial world, which we have not included yet in this model, the financial world was sort of up to things that I think not everybody really understood. I myself worked in finance for 19 years, and I had never heard of some of these instruments that some of these banks and insurance companies were buying and selling to each other. I'd never heard of them, and they were on unregulated markets with price visibility and whatnot. And so that contributed pretty much to it. So when we talk about the financial economy, the financial flow, we're really talking about the money economy. And included with this is going to be the inclusion of the financial sector, which we are going to do a bit later in the class. We'll talk about why that's important. And if anybody remembers, it's been a while now, so you may not be totally clear or you may not remember it, but when the financial system was sort of teetering and tottering back in 2008, 2009, a lot of people were wondering why the government stepped in and tried to rescue it. A lot of people saying, why is Wall Street getting a bailout? Where's Main Street's bailout? Well, Main Street actually did get some bailouts, but really it's Wall Street affects everybody. And the term Wall Street just kind of sounds like it's alien and distant and shadowy and all that. And really all it is a metaphor for the financial economy. And yeah, maybe some of the actors were not particularly deserving of relief, but it wasn't done as a matter of who deserves what. It was done as a way to save the economy, which is why we're going to make a case over and over that regulation is a pretty critical part of where government fits into the economy. And we're going to talk plenty throughout this course about what government does and why it does it, how government fits in to the picture. And it, in fact, is one of the differentiating factors between the various schools of economics and what some of their how they differ from one another in that regard. Okay, so it's going to come up again and again in terms of being fairly critical to this discussion. So I'll leave this here. And the good news about for those, even if you're here now, you can go and watch the video later if you want to sort of reproduce this. And I think I'm going to give you a little bit. I'm going to try to use this board over here. The camera angles aren't particularly good. It'd be nice if we had this camera set back a bit, but I've never used this room before, so I didn't realize that this is really kind of a difficult view, but I'm going to try to use this board over here. I think you can probably see it. I think the lights are up about as much as I can. Because what I wanted to do is this, and if you go to the syllabus for last week, the one thing that we really did not get to was this idea of my discussing the Appendix A in the textbook. So Hopefully everyone's had a chance to either obtain the book, the physical book, or if you prefer, which is what I would sort of recommend, getting the just going online and look at the free copy of that. Has anybody had a chance to look at the online textbook? And it's pretty easy to navigate, right? It's pretty easy to read. Believe me, we spent a lot of time trying to find texts which are free, and there are a lot about that not very good, frankly. But it's a lot better to have this one. And if you want to, I know we've had some people buy the physical text and they want to do that. That's perfectly fine. It's whatever your preference is. But certainly free is a lot better than what our old textbook was, which was I think $160. So rather expensive text. Okay. So what I want to do in this, and I mentioned this at the outset of class on Tuesday of last week, is I want to talk about some of the math expectations for this class, because I know that sometimes people have math anxiety. I get it. I don't know what it's about, but I know a lot of people have it. Well, I guess I do know what it's about. It's kind of looks goofy and foreign. And if you don't work with math a lot, it's a little bit difficult to sort of wrap your arms around it. But I want to make sure that everyone is familiar with what we're doing and how far we're going to go in this class in terms of the math. And then we'll sort of set the outer limits for that. So, okay, so let's start here with something you probably have seen before. Maybe it's been a while, but the Cartesian coordinate plane. We've got 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you got this value here called the origin. And I'm going to orient you a lot of times in this class when we do graphical representations of things like markets, entire economies, or individual markets within the economy. I'm going to orient you back to the origin, because a lot of times if people want to talk about is demand increasing or decreasing, or is supply increasing or decreasing, orienting yourself to the origin is the way to sort of get your bearings. It's sort of the North Star here, only it's the zero value. And so it's an important thing to sort of keep in mind. One thing that we should mention is, even though we've got some coordinates here, which usually on this and a y-axis, you've got some sort of ordered pair, some xy sort of value. And if this corresponds to, if you drag these to their coordinates, you've got some x1, y1. And if for some reason the observation changes, now you've got some new values where now x has moved to x2 and y has moved to y2. Then we've got some new coordinate system right there. And so you've got x1, y1, x2, y2. And so these coordinates are going to be very important. And if you drag them back to their respective values, and so just kind of be familiar with what those are about. One of the things about this is this, that sometimes these values change, and we can sort of kind of connect these up sometimes and end up with a straight line. And a straight line tends to have this very generic algebraic formula that should be familiar to you, but it may not be. I equals mx plus b. Now, first of all, let's talk about what this formulaic discussion is about here. And let's talk a bit about functions, because I think it's very important that we get to functions before we even go any bit further. And that is, functions take the very generic, it is some function of x, y equals f of x. And the equal sign is very important here, because you can substitute often f of x for y in very many cases, okay? And we'll get to the linear function here in just a minute. But for right now, I just want to talk in general about functions, because not all of them are going to be straight lines, okay? You're going to have lots of curves. And even though we're not going to be using calculus in this course, we are going to be talking about slopes, because slopes are very important relationships for what we're doing. But f of x, what you're really saying here is the idea that, and it's really sort of, let's really break into what this function is telling us from, if you just substitute the words for the symbols, that y is a function of x. That is essentially y does what x is essentially telling it to do, particularly when there is dependency. And with dependency, we say this y value is what's known as a dependent variable. A dependent variable. If there's dependency going on here, not all equations have this, but a lot do, and a lot in our course are going to do that. A dependent variable. What is a dependent variable? A dependent variable doesn't really do anything. It just only reflects. It's sort of the scoreboard, if you like. And it scores, it raises and lowers the score depending on what's going on over here on this side, the X value then is what would be called an independent variable. And an independent variable is different. So when it comes to economics, whether it's micro or macro or one, these are variables that are subject to control or management. Subject to management or control. And that is, you can do something about it, okay? You can do something about these variables. It doesn't mean you're always going to be successful, but those are the control variables. Those are the variables you're seeking to manage in order to achieve the result, which is some kind of score on the scoreboard. So if you think about the football, right, since football's heating up right now in terms of playoffs, if the X variable, if the X values of the players on the field, if the player on the field scores a touchdown, the scoreboard goes up by 6 points, right? And it's not the other way around. The scoreboard operator doesn't put 6 points on, and then a player says, "Oh, I'm going to go score a touchdown." We know it doesn't work that way. Directionality and dependency is really the issue. And so, what does this mean in economics then, aside from this generic football example? It means that in economics, maybe the dependent variable is something like personal income. And as policymakers, we want to sort of increase personal income to the extent that we can. Well, we don't just say, okay, personal income go up, right? We have to work on the factors which go into personal income, like perhaps personal taxes. Maybe we want to lower personal taxes, or maybe we want to give stimulus checks to people. And that used to be a kind of a crazy idea, but it's not been so crazy in the last 2 or 3 years, certainly. So that would be subject to control, something we can manage. We can manage cutting taxes, we can manage increasing stimulus, we can do all these things in order to achieve the result of increasing that dependent variable, because it depends upon what our actions are, okay? And then when we talk about functions too, one of the things that's really interesting is, I know my daughter had a textbook years ago that I thought laid out the definition of a function better than what I'd seen it before. And personally, I do think, and I know it's kind of bad form for people in academia to criticize other disciplines, but really I think one of the difficulties a lot of people have with math is it's probably not taught very well, even in K through 12. And I don't feel like I really got the nature of a function probably until I was in high school, maybe not even until college. And I can remember the first time I saw functions, I think the discussion was that there was some sort of, we dropped an X into a box and a Y popped out. Something magical was going on in this little machine, this little box that was making it work, and it popped to work.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah.
And I always thought, what a stupid example. I thought it was dumb, and I still think it doesn't make any sense. And it's like, what's going on in the box, right? What's going on in this little magic machine that's creating some output? And so I don't know, maybe some people got value on it, some didn't. I particularly didn't. But one thing that I thought was very interesting is my daughter had a textbook that talked about a functional relationship between y and x is that there's one unique y for every unique x, and that you can't have more than one x value for every y value. So in other words, a straight line would not be a function because you've got one x and multiple y's, and that would not be a functional relationship. So in other words, we say it fails what's called the vertical line test. The vertical line test says it's not a function in that particular case. But the example of this textbook was the idea of the high school prom, right? Where you've got one unique boy going with one unique girl, right? And I know today it's a little bit different. I don't really want to get into the politics of gender and whatnot, but I think for what it is as an example, I think it's useful. That is, it's not one boy with two girls or two girls with one boy or any kind of other combination. It's simply one value of one thing and one value of another thing. They go together uniquely, and that they are uniquely as these change. And so I think that is a pretty good illustration, rather than some sort of functional relationship. The functional relationship we can get into by observing what happens to these particular variables. But that's what's important, what's going on with functions. And we're going to use the term function a lot when it comes to things like, well, something like the demand function. What is the demand function? It's a functional relationship between the quantity demanded of goods and the price of those goods. We'll get into those more next week, but there's a connection between those. And so we're going to say for each unique price, there's a unique quantity demanded for that. And so as a result, this allows us to understand what demand looks like. Okay. So when we come back to this idea of y equals mx plus b, this is the generic formula then for a straight line, right? Which is what we've got here when we connect in two-dimensional space. We connect 2 points and we get a straight line, right? So we have the x value, which we know. We have the y value. The b is the intercept if it does cross the y axis, and if it does, and it doesn't. And this m value is very important because that is the what? That is the slope of the function, okay? And let's talk a bit about slopes because it's going to be very important in this course. And so when we talk about slope from a strictly mathematical standpoint, it's simply the rise over the run on a straight line. That is the change in the y versus the change in the x. And so we use the delta symbol, in the Greek delta symbol, for change in y, which is the vertical, the rise, right, the y-axis, and the change in x, which is the horizontal axis. I know for those of you who are very strong at math, this may just be awful and boring you to tears. I want to make sure everyone's sort of on the same page as we get going here. So the delta symbol, the little triangle, it represents pretty much everywhere that I have ever seen it's used in all the sciences, physical sciences, social sciences. It simply means change in something, right? Delta X, delta Y, something, whatever is going on. So we might talk about delta G, delta government spending, right? And that'll come up again and again, this idea of change in something. So what is this change in something? And what does it really tell you? It was a terrible eraser, isn't it? Wow, it's not doing a very good job at all, is it? Okay. Am I using it the wrong direction? Oh, yeah, that's worse. This is like the worst. It's like the world's worst eraser.
That's a whiteboard.
We've got like some kind of cloth here. I don't know what this is about. And that's, I guess, a little. Oh, geez.
You have the spray.
Huh?
The spray right there.
Yeah, but what should I have to spray? I mean, we're going backwards in time here or something. I don't know. Okay, well, all right, I guess, okay, well, it works, doesn't it? Well, what's this eraser for then? I mean, okay, well, this is something different. So let's make the classroom look like a classroom.
Right.
We're just pretending it's a classroom with it. So, yeah. Okay, all right. So I think we don't have the spray anymore. I guess we're not spraying down the desks anymore, but cool. Right now we're spraying down the board. So, okay, so what about this? Delta X, delta Y, delta X. So, and what is it about and how do we measure it at all times? Well, it's basically this. Every time you have a delta value, it's always going to be nu minus old, right? So in this case, delta Y is going to, and if you've got delta X, it's going to be one of the denominator, it's going to be nu minus old. And so you can always plug these values in here in order to arrive at slope. And what is slope? What is this? What is the definition of slope that we should know about? Particularly not so much as we're interested in from just a purely mathematical standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. We're talking about essentially the rate of change, right? It's the rate of change in one variable in relation to change in another variable, right? Some of this is in your appendix A and whatnot. The rate of change in one variable in relation to change in another variable. And this is very important because it's going to tell us some things. First of all, it is a mathematical relationship. And so it's going to tell us the strength or the weakness of the responsiveness of one variable in relation to another variable. But also it's going to tell us the direction. So in this case, if we were to sort of plug in values here, let's just put in random numbers. And let's say this is 7, this is 10, and this is 4, and this is 8, let's say, right? Then we can determine what the slope of this particular straight line is, right? Simply by plugging numbers in. So it's 8 minus 4 over 10 minus 7. And so it happens that we've got 8 minus 4 is 4, 10 minus 7 is 3. And so you've got 4, so 1 1/3 is the slope of that function. So it's a fairly steep function. And the thing that's missing here is the idea of sign, which obviously is not needed when it's a positive value. But a positive slope basically tells us what? it tells us as one variable goes up, the other thing goes up. So if you, the other variable that is, so if you've got a positive slope, it's basically saying this, that as x goes up, so does y. As x goes down, so does y. Okay, and that's what a positive slope tells us. In other words, there's a direct relationship. The functional relationship is direct. As one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. And if there's a dependency issue, which we started to talk a little bit about here, that is if you want to sort of manipulate and manage the x and say, look, raise x, then we should expect to get some sort of rise in y. And the strength of that rise in y, that dependent value, is the slope of that function. It's not just the direction, which if we're trying to get both to go up, it's not just the direction, it's how much we get a response out of that. So for instance, there are real life applications, a lot of which probably affect all of you or people in your family and whatnot. And that was when the pandemic hit. This is not that long ago, right? The government sent stimulus checks out to people or credited their bank accounts and whatnot. And what did they expect people to do with that money, really? Not everyone did it because not everyone lost their jobs or whatever, but the government really wanted to support what element in the economy is really important. Would you go do what with it? Buy stocks, or we wanted you to shut up and go and buy stuff, right? Pay bills and go buy things, right? To support the economy, right? Now, we know, of course, that a lot of people took the stimulus who didn't lose their jobs, and we didn't lose our jobs here. It was just money from the sky. And so this is why a lot of people were buying stocks and whatnot. The stock market had a bit of a rally during this time. And there was a big increase in price. But that wasn't the intent. The intent was to support spending through the economy. And the stimulus, I think, as we'll get deeper down the road here, we'll probably see that the stimulus may have been a little bit excessive in terms of the size. But it did ward off what could have been a pretty serious downturn in the economy. So they did it because they wanted to support. The X value was total demand for goods throughout the economy. Y value that was subject to control was the amount of spendable income. Okay, so that would be a positive slope. A negative slope would be the other direction, where if, in fact, they're just the opposite. If X goes up, Y goes down. If X goes down, Y goes up. So that's an inverse relationship, an inverse or negative relationship. If one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. And this is very often the case. If we raise taxes, we expect spending to go down. If we raise interest rates, we would expect spending to go down, which, by the way, is what is happening at this moment. I mean, at this very second, but that's what's happening throughout the economy. Our government is trying to raise interest rates, and it's done by our Federal Reserve. And we're going to talk plenty about that entity here in this class. But they're trying to raise interest rates in order to really slow the economy down, because the economy is racing sort of out of control. And the evidence of that is the fact that we've got inflation. And we've got inflation like we had, price inflation is a general rise in prices that we really haven't seen in the better part of 40 years. And so as a result, the government's trying to slow things down. By working on this relationship where the interest rate is the Y value and the X value would be demand for goods throughout the economy, because those goods, the demand for those parts of the economy that are very interest sensitive, automobiles, anything connected to real estate, for instance, is going to be impacted. And we're starting to see that happen. And in fact, I think we're going to see a lot more evidence that the economy is slowing down. I mean, a lot of us have been sort of predicting that the economy would have been slowing down before now, but we've got such a strong labor market. In fact, the unemployment rate actually fell last month in December. It didn't go up. And so even though the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates last year, it's taking some time for these things to sort of kick in. And so as a result, we'll see what happens. So, okay. So this is essentially what's going on. This is really all that I wanted to cover from the standpoint of this sort of math piece. And I realize that some of you come with a lot stronger math backgrounds than others. That's fine. And so, if you are good at math, and hopefully this wasn't too painful, but I know that sometimes people wonder how deeply we're going to get into some of the math piece, because frankly, the notes in the back look like it might be a little bit more challenging from that standpoint than what it really is. In fact, the prerequisite for this class is in fact very accurate. We do not require lots and lots of math, and it's not necessary. Now, if you at some point decide down the road you want to major in economics, well, that's a different story. You may, you may need to some other math, but for right now, that's not what we're getting into. Okay. All right. So questions for me about any of that? Okay. Well, what I want to do is this. I want to sort of move on, and I'm going to be sort of weaving in and out. I think I mentioned this a few times. Sort of weaving in and out between chapters 1 and 2. So for those of you, so if you're reading along in the textbook, you might think, well, wait a minute, this is out of order. Well, this is not unusual that we would take things in sort of a different order than what we're always seeing them. However, I will, beginning with chapter 3, which deals with demand and supply, it'll be a little more obvious as to where we're coming from at each time. So what I want to do is this, and I'll be posting this slide here in just a little bit when I get back to my office, but I do want to talk about the next bit of information here, and I'm going to scroll the camera back to what we call factors of production. So again, the overall theme of these first 2 chapters, before we really get into getting into demand and supply and into hardcore economics, is the sort of introductory concept of the who, what, when, where, why of economics. Is that too dark? It seems awfully dark. Is that too dark for you guys? Okay, it just seems awfully, okay. Because I can't figure out what button to hit to get this sort of intermediate. I don't know if there is. I think it's either on or off. So, okay, so what we want to do is this. We want to talk about factors of production and what they are. What are factors of production? Well, let's look at this, first of all, from the standpoint of inputs and outputs, okay? So what is the most basic relationship that we can think of anywhere in economics? And we've sort of got some of this here up on the circular flow model. We've got inputs sort of going into the hopper, and out in the other end comes outputs, right? Here I'm sort of risking running into that function definition, but that's essentially what's going on. Labor is an input, all kinds of raw materials are an input. All these things are sort of inputs into the process, and then outputs are these things like the goods and the services that pop out the other end. And so this is an important thing for us to talk about. So what about these input factors, also known as factors of production? We can sort of categorize them by putting them in sort of 4 categories: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. And if you were to have taken this course, I know when I was an undergraduate, it used to be land, labor, and capital, and that had been around 1700s. This idea of there are three main topics of factors of production. They are land, labor, and capital. And at some point, probably I think in the early 90s, entrepreneurial ability sort of became a thing, and as a separate category. But let's talk about what these are here, and we'll give some examples as to what they are as well. And so I've got a little bit of a challenge here because I've got a board and I've got a screen going. And so I'm going to sort of make sure that you can see, for those of you watching the video, you can see what I'm doing here. And I was this board down every time I use it here. So let me, I'll let this dry. So what about land? Land is the original one. And by the way, when we say these go back to the 1700s, I mean, we're literally saying these are some of the very, very oldest definitional terms in economics. Before there really was even sort of an official sort of academic discipline called economics, before econ sort of split off from political science, we have these definitions of land, labor, and capital. So what are they? What are some of the definitions that we could talk about here? When we talk about land, what we're really saying is we're talking about natural resources, okay? We're talking about things that come to us by our virtue of being on the same planet as these goods. And so land is really sort of just a euphemism here. Oh, that board is still kind of wet, geez. Okay, well, all right, let me let that. I don't think I've ever had to deal with a wet whiteboard before, so I apologize for the weirdness here, but so land is what we refer to as natural resources. That is things which come to us by virtue of our simply being on the same planet as these goods. And that is the idea that we don't have to go find them, or we just have to find them, we don't have to create them. Are in and of themselves inputs into a production process, okay? They're themselves inputs into a production process. And I think what I'm going to do here is sort of show you that board here as we go, and I'm going to turn some of the lights up so we can see that. So we talk about natural resources. What are we really talking about here? In terms of very broad categories, what are we talking about in terms of natural resources? Things like what? Well, we're talking about things like minerals, certainly, right? We don't have to create minerals, we just have to go get minerals, whether it's oil or coal or gems or copper or any of these kinds of things. We just have to sort of get them, that they come to us by our virtue of our being on the same planet with them. So minerals are one thing. And again, so it's not really just land as land. It might include land, but it's more than just land. It would include things like water. It would include things like, and by the way, anthropologists will talk about a shift in humanity's sort of relationship to some of these natural entities, such as the idea of growing of plant life, a certain segment, a very small subsegment, being growing crops. That is, we can't harness all plants for use as crops that we use to create food and seed and feed all that, but rather there's a subset of all plant life which becomes growing crops. And likewise, there's a subset of the animal kingdom, a very small subset, which we were able to sort of corral and use for our own purposes, and that's livestock. So in other words, livestock would be one particular bit of that. That is a very small segment of the animal kingdom, is essentially controlled by humans to be used as inputs, whether it's meat or wool or whatever. Growing crops, whether it's used to create seeds or whatever. So sorry about that. So livestock, those come to us by our virtue of being on the same planet. And then what else are we talking about? We're talking about things as well like wind, right? And sun, wind and solar power. I think these are going to become more important as inputs, particularly in terms of energy going forward. There's no question of the fact that the global climate is changing. A lot of it's because of the fact that we're releasing too much carbon and have been doing it for years plus. And so as a result, the climate is changing. And so as a result, we're trying to find ways to deal with this. And one of the ways that we create electricity in a lot of parts of the country is we burn coal in order to turn generators to generate electricity. Well, obviously, in this part of the country, we've got a bit of an advantage. We've got lots of wind, we've got lots of sunlight. Maybe not so much today, but it can create inputs, particularly in terms of electricity, which would be output. Electricity is an output. And by the way, electricity is an output that then becomes used as other things. And so as a result, you can see that as we're going to talk about the chain of value, some outputs themselves are inputs, such as we would call those intermediate goods, right? So P&M creates electricity, and that's their output, but then it becomes an input for somebody else, like a manufacturer to use, like for all of us to use. We're using electricity here. That becomes the input, okay? So land as natural resources, that's the first category. Labor, let's talk about what labor is. This might sound pretty obvious as to what labor really refers to, but instead, we're going to sort of expand this definition a bit and call this the term human capital, okay? This is a term that's coined, I think about 60-some years ago by one of President Kennedy's economic advisors. And he talked about this idea of human capital as being something apart from labor. Because I think the definition and understanding of labor is related to inputs into a production process was pretty basic, and that is people showing up for work and exerting physical labor, which is why this term physical flow as it applies to labor may be a bit of an outdated term. It's still used just because it's still around, but so is the term labor. Even though, you know, you think of people laboring to breathe and all that as being a real physical exertion, it may not be that. Instead, what is a more modern understanding of what human capital is, all of the things that people bring to the labor market in order to be able to sell as their output. So households have an output themselves, and that is their labor. But what is the input? All the things that they go into. Well, what are you all doing here? It's giving you, it's creating an input so that you can create more valuable outputs. What are you doing here? And more importantly, what are you going to bring to a potential employer down the road? Okay, nobody knows why they're here. Okay. I don't know why you're here. I don't even know. Well, education is always one of those, right? That would be one of those factors. So education is one of those. Obviously, there's a direct connection between education and the ability to bring more human capital to the table. And by the way, I think that the experience is beginning to show that, well, it's not beginning to show, it's been demonstrated for quite some time that every year of post-secondary education that someone gets translates directly to higher lifetime earnings. This is not theoretical, it's been demonstrated by the Department of Education, by independent studies for years and years and years. Even if one doesn't achieve a degree, it still results in a higher amount of lifetime earnings. And I think one reason for this is the fact that you bring more value to employers, more flexibility, more background. Also, one of the things that I think education does, and it may seem a little bit arbitrary to those in school, and certainly to those who've never gone to college at all, because a lot of people have never been to college and talk about getting a piece of paper and whatnot. I've never known a college graduate of any degree a piece of paper because they feel very proud of it, and they should, because nobody can ever take it away from them. But what does that signal to employers? One of these things that we call a signal in economics. So I'll just give you an example, and I'll talk about the signal. So for example, if you go to a doctor, the doctor walks in wearing a white lab coat and looks very professional, okay, it's a doctor, right? If the doctor walked in wearing, I don't know, a dirty t-shirt and and shorts and flip-flops, you think, is this the doctor, right? Who are you? What are you doing? Don't touch me. Who are you, right? So that would be a signal, right? That person doesn't look like a doctor, right? So what does a college degree or any kind of college training represent to an employer? What does it tell an employer? And why do they care? I mean, obviously they do care, but why do they care? Well, one thing, it signals that you can finish, right? Is that you can start something you can finish, particularly if you're a degree seeker, it shows you can finish something. So we don't make it easy on people to get degrees. It takes a while, it takes years. Nobody gets it done in a few months. And it's a stick-to-itiveness. And we make you take a lot of classes that, frankly, you probably don't like. That's just the way it is. But it's to give a well-rounded bit of experience. One of those. But it's apart from training. Because if education is more generalized, and it is, even though, of course, we have specialized programs like nursing and engineering, which are very distinct to a profession. An engineer could probably not get a job as a nurse and vice versa. Those are specific. It is still more broad-based. Training, though, is more job-specific. Because even somebody who graduates with some sort of degree program also requires some degree of on-the-job training, just so that they're familiar with what exactly to speak. So training is more job specific. Okay. So that's one thing. And what is one thing too that's important? And maybe in the end, particularly for those in the labor market who've been in the labor market for a while, that is probably more important than either of these two. And it's something that you see in job wanted ads all the time. And you either got it or you don't. What is it? It starts with E. Experience is critical, because what is it about experience? First of all, you either have it or you don't. It also really can't be learned that easily, right? I mean, a lot of textbooks don't have discussions about what to do in this particular situation, right? It just, you have to learn through experience of how we handle it. And I talk about the example, my mom was in the legal profession for a lot of years. And toward the end of her career, she was handling a lot of things like estates and probates and whatnot. She started out in criminal law, so she didn't like that very much, but was doing that kind of work. And it's very technical, and there are a lot of laws that are overlapping state and federal laws. And when she left, some of her law partners would occasionally call her after she left, because it's like, well, how do we this is what I've got. Can you tell me where we file this? How do we argue this? Whatever. It's because they just didn't know. They couldn't figure it out because they didn't have the experience in that area. And this is something that we're beginning to see happening more and more, particularly as some of these very experienced workers are leaving the labor force. And we occasionally run across articles that talk about these baby boomers who are leaving the market, who are leaving the labor market, taking their experience with them. And when they take their experience, they take all the things that they've seen before and had to deal with. So experience is important, and employers value it. And because you can't teach it. You can't read a book, you can't, well, you just have to be there. So that's an example, education, training, experience, even things like skills. That is, skills are a little bit more, again, job specific, like what is it you can do? Sometimes employers will want to know what you can do if you're on a construction site, being hired by an employer, what exactly can you do? You know, what tools can you work with? What are you certified in, right? That sort of thing. So certifications are important. In lots and lots of areas, the labor market requires certifications to do certain things. The lady that cuts my hair is going to have a license to do that. So she has to have some degree of training. And so you kind of get the idea. So those are aspects of what we call human capital. And by the way, I just want to sort of clear up one thing here, because so we've got this term human capital, which is sort of an elaboration, maybe sort of a modernization of that very old term labor. And then we've got one called capital. So can we be more clear as to what we're talking about here? Well, first of all, let's clear up a little bit of confusion and talk about this word capital before we move on to the number 3 category of capital. So what is capital in general? It may be the least well-defined term everywhere in economics and finance, because it can refer to a lot of different things depending upon the context of what and how it's being presented. Capital could refer to a strict accounting measure of the difference between assets and liabilities of a company. That would be capital. You could say that I've got a pension fund with X dollars, and that would be my capital that I'm saving for retirement. That could count as capital. It could be, in economics, we tend to use the term in terms of productive resources that we use. That could be capital. But we'll use one term or one sort of definition here for capital. That it should be a catch-all for all uses, and that is anything which can be built upon to produce future value. Okay, anything which can be built upon to produce future value would be capital. So, since football playoffs are upon us, we often hear that a team recovered a fumble and they didn't do anything with it, had to punt the ball themselves. So as a result, the announcers say they failed to capitalize, right? In other words, they failed to build upon that which they could have used to produce future value. So that is the term capital. It's a pretty generic definition, but it sort of covers all uses of it, because in fact, it is a bit confusing when you hear the word capitalist. What exactly are we talking about? Because it really does depend upon the particular usage. And Karl Marx wrote a gigantic work, I think it's 2 volumes, called Capital, where he went into all these different areas of what capital meant. And so obviously he's not everyone's cup of tea, but you kind of get the idea that it's a fairly broad category of discussion. Okay, so having said all that, then we come to this, again, one of the 3 original terms. We come to capital as being this example of how we use in economics. And we're talking here about something as physical productive capital generally. And even here, sort of generalizing a little bit, let me see, physical productive assets, I think simply define it. Physical productive assets used in production. So capital in this context is going to refer to business assets. Now, what is an asset? And I know that everyone's had accounting before, but if you have an account, an asset is simply anything which is owned. I know the accounting professionals got a very distinct definition that talks about assets as being something created by past transactions which have future service value, like a receivable. I expect to collect a receivable from my customer. That's an asset, right? And so that would be one definition. But assets in our context are going to be used is simply to say anything that is owned. Anything that is owned. So in this context, what capital refers to are business assets, things which are used in production. And even the term physical is a little bit misleading, I must say, because when the term was first talking about things that were very distinct to it, things like machinery and equipment, right? Which obviously have a very definite physical characteristic. Machinery, I think the difference between machinery and equipment is that machinery, as I understand it, has moving parts and equipment does not. Obviously, those terms are used interchangeably. It doesn't make, not really splitting hairs that much, but that's sort of the original idea of what this was about in terms of capital, particularly as the Industrial Revolution was just beginning, right? To differentiate the from the things like, and keep in mind, it's really started in the textile industry, things like wool and flax, which came from the land, and then all the machinery that was being used. It was the use of technology that really kickstarted the Industrial Revolution, which I make the case, particularly in my Econ 1110, was probably the most radical thing to happen to humanity from an economic standpoint, without any question. Completely changed standard of living, life expectancy, population growth, all that. Okay, so machinery and equipment would be one example. It could also include things like technology in general, which again is a fairly broad category, obviously. Technology, and then even things which is perhaps a subset of this, but I want to sort of point this out here as being distinct, and that is it does not have a physical nature, but it is a productive asset, and that's software. Obviously, there's software for consumer use, where you're the end user, that is your input in anything, but you're using it as an output for your own purposes. But software does not have a physical characteristic, so it sort of violates that very old school definition. But it is very important to differentiate software from technology in general, because what's the more valuable part of the computing business? Is it hardware or software? And it's software, and every year that goes by, software is much more valuable, and will continue to be. So it's really the sort of the brains of that, which is really interesting, because when computing really began, the first and software was sort of thought to be sort of a, just a part of the hardware, really. And in fact, it probably was. So you get the idea. These are all things that are used in production to create other goods. So inputs go into the hopper to create other goods. So natural resources are used, whether it's things like grains and leather and milk and all that, water, and whether it's things like people power, and then capital, which are all the goods, non-human goods, which are used in production. So category, that's entrepreneurial ability. This is the newest, and I suspect one of the reasons why economists came up with this is probably there was a lot of discussion, maybe some prompting even from business schools in the subject. So we think about entrepreneurial ability. What are we really talking about here? Well, first of all, we think about an entrepreneur, we think about an individual, and sometimes, certain people's names come up as an, did I spell that right? That's kind of a long word, is entrepreneurial ability. We think of entrepreneurs like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and people, Steve Jobs and whatnot. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about entrepreneurial ability. And why is it that, and by the way, why is it distinct from labor? Because isn't that the human element? Certainly a human element here too. And so what exactly is it that we're talking about that makes this something different? Well, it's the special sauce. It's the X factor that is not accounted for anywhere here. It's sort of a magical value. And that is simply this. And it's something that is considered to be critical, even though it's sort of difficult to measure and even identify ahead of time. That's the ability and willingness to assume risk. The ability and willingness to assume risk, particularly business risk. The ability and willingness to assume risk is really at the heart of what entrepreneurship is about. When we think about entrepreneurs, we think of individuals who are willing to take risks and are willing to do that others are not, risking their own capital, taking big risks with their capital, other people's money, and as a result, they are trying to create something of great value, right? And not everyone's cut out for this. In fact, I think, excuse me, I think there's a lot of evidence that this is not widely, not a widely distributed particular trait. And in fact, I know there are a lot of graduate business programs, and there are a lot of programs out there for executives to try to teach the idea of entrepreneurial thinking. That is originality, thinking outside the box, so to speak. Trying to do things a little bit different, thinking about things in a different way. Those kinds of things are all elements of what are called entrepreneurial ability. And that is the idea of trying to do things a little bit differently. Products that seem impossible, but come about working out. And if you think about it, some entrepreneurs, right? Think about Bill Gates, who left Harvard, with this very audacious statement that he can no longer learn anything from them. So arguably the best university in the world, he says they can't teach him anything anymore. So he starts a business in an industry that really didn't exist, a company on the planet, and offered to sell them a product which he didn't have. He didn't have the DOS product that he said he had. That's pretty risky. I mean, that's a pretty big risk to take. And so you kind of get the idea that these are risk takers. So, they sort of fit that particular mold. I used to talk about Martha Stewart, and I guess we still can, even though she's sort of a commercial the other day, and we haven't seen much of her lately, but she started this with cookbooks and TV shows and whatnot. And it was very much sort of a household lifestyle sort of guru. And then ended up in prison for insider trading. Actually, I think she got charged with lying to the FBI. At the time, lying to the FBI was actually a crime. But and so a lot of people say, well, why are you using Martha Stewart as an example? Because that's not a very good example. Somebody ended up going to prison, but it almost is emblematic of this idea of taking big risks. She took a risk by engaging in a stock trade, which was clearly illegal, and then lying about it, ended up losing. So, but because with big risks come both big returns and also potentially big losses. And this is the reason why not everybody has this sort of mentality to be a true entrepreneur, because are you willing to risk it all? And you really are. You're willing to risk a lot by being an entrepreneur. So think of somebody who quits their job to become an entrepreneur and start their own business. They're taking a big risk. And if you just consider the fact that the facts of the statistics are really against people. I mean, very clear, most businesses fail within the first 5 years because most of them are very undercapitalized, starting out, and can't make it through the first downturn in the economy. Sometimes grow too quickly and hire workers that they don't need, and all this. So it's a real balancing act. So this is sort of the X factor that sort of worked its way into this discussion of the factors of production. Okay. All right. So questions about anything here from me on that? Okay. We're going to get into goods and services. I think I'm going to wait and get into this on Thursday. And the next bit of this that I want to talk about is something called the production possibilities model. I've only got about 4 minutes. I don't really think I've got time to get into it today. So questions about anything that I talked about here so far? And anybody on the Zoom call can feel free to pipe up here. I've been looking at the chats, and I don't think there's anything necessarily directed to me here, but I'll take a look here and see as we're done. But yeah, go ahead.
Would there be any examples to the entrepreneurial ability?
Examples, yeah, it would be any kind of a business that is started up from scratch or in a new industry or whatnot. If you think of Elon Musk, for instance, of course, he's maybe one of the best examples, walking and talking right now, of an entrepreneur facing the risks and rewards. So he started Tesla, right? Founder of Tesla. Tesla's been an amazingly successful company, even though it still is eking out a very small market share. And it's getting there, but the products are very expensive and all that. But he's talked about this idea: you've got to grow, you've got to move down the cost curve over time. So he understands that. But then he does this sort of inexplicable thing by buying Twitter, which I think now has almost universally been judged to be a real huge mistake. And I think it's emblematic of the idea that there are risks and rewards, and there are losses and gains that can be had in very big ways in both directions. So any kind of startup, and if you think about there have been lots and lots and lots of startups in software, in biotechnology in the last few years, more than ever before. And even these things called orphan drugs, which are drugs that really don't have much of a market, but there's a need for them. And so sometimes you get lots of government funding. That would be an example of starting a particular product in an area where there's really no market as of yet. So there are lots of examples, any kind of stuff. And even if you go back in time, somebody like Henry Ford, who created the auto industry in this country, probably people thought he was, but I imagine people thought Bill Gates was crazy as well. So that's kind of an example of what we're talking about. It's sort of X factor that economists point to as entrepreneurial ability. Anybody in the Zoom call want to ask anything? All right, when we come back on Thursday, I will get into the production possibilities frontier. So I'm talking about the who, what, when, where, why. This will be actually some of the how and some of the choices made, because we remember what the definition of economics was. Choices made under conditions of scarcity. And so we're going to talk more about the idea of scarcity and about trade-offs, and that's an important issue. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk more about goods and services. And then we might be opening the door a little bit to, it should be a fairly broad and multi-day discussion about supply and demand. Okay. All right. Everybody have a great rest of your day. See you on Thursday. If you didn't sign in, feel free to do that, as well as the seating chart here. And I'll leave this local collector for you.